Hello, I'm Oliver, the GMAT Maestro. Welcome to your virtual trial class. Today I'm going to give you an idea of how the class functions, what the dynamics of the class are, but also give you a chance to get to know me a little bit, as well as, learn a couple of GMAT tips. So normally at the beginning of any class, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes either getting to know or catching up with my student. I want to know how they're doing in their personal life, their job, how they're doing with GMAT studying. All of this information, of course, on a limited scale, will help me best coach them, right? It'll help me determine when I need to, maybe push a student a little bit harder, or maybe when we need to go back a little bit and reinforce some earlier concepts. So basically I like to have an idea of what we're working with. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the error log, right? Hold on. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen first. Share my screen with you. Now you can see what I see. And I've got your error log up here on the screen. Now, before taking a look at the specific questions that you got wrong, we may take a look at the error type dashboard, which will give an idea of what mistakes you're making. Obviously, there's only 2 mistakes here, so it's not a lot of data to work with. But as you progress further in the error log and make more mistakes, we'll start to see patterns develop. Now, topics, we see that, okay, you've worked on 2 topics so far. You've gotten about 90% on each of them. So no, hot spot of something that really needs to be reinforced. And then your data sufficiency problem solving breakdown shows me that, okay, here's a little bit of a difference here, right? While problem solving is above 90%, data sufficiency is only 80%. And so this may mean that we need to take a closer look at perhaps the data sufficiency procedure and make sure that you're actually following it step by step. Okay, so let's take a look at the actual questions. Now, one thing that I'd like to point out, you've done a good job at writing C in class and highlighting in red those specific questions that you want to see today. This makes it very easy for me to immediately go to those questions and not waste time talking about, oh, what question do we need to see? Oh, you write a certain comment that is vague and that isn't very clear, like, oh, I didn't understand this. Well, does didn't understand mean you still don't understand it? Or does it mean that you didn't understand it, then you figured it out, and now you understand it, right? So by putting clearly C in class in red, it lets me help you get the most out of your class time. So let's take a look at this first question up in the number properties section. Okay, so this is a data sufficiency question. And first thing I'm going to determine is whether it's a yes/no question or a value question. And is X, Y even? That is a yes/no type of question. So I'm going to write YN. I go back at the beginning. It says if X and Y are integers. So I know that X, Y are integers. They could be negative integers, 0, or positive integers. And now I need to simplify the question, right? Is X, Y even, right? So I could simply write X, Y is even. And that is the question that I'm trying to answer. Or I could write something like X, Y over 2 is an integer. These are equivalent questions. They mean exactly the same thing logically. And so I can answer either of them. Right? So one thing I want to notice before we go on and look at the statements is that what we are looking for here is we're looking to determine whether a compound variable, X, Y, is even or not, right? So when you have a compound variable in a data sufficiency question, you don't necessarily have to be able to solve for each of the variables individually. You need to think of it as kind of one variable in and of itself. So for example, if we take a look at the first statement, right, statement 1, if you were trying to just solve for each of the individual variables, you would see, oh, I have one equation and 2 variables, which means that I can't solve for this, okay? But we're not solving for x and y individually. We're solving for them together. So what I could do, for example, is I could actually manipulate this equation, x equals y plus 1, to be in terms of x, y. So if I multiply both sides by y, I get xy equals y times y plus 1. Okay, so I have now solved for xy. Now, y times y plus 1. Well, what do I know about those numbers? I know that y is an integer, and therefore y plus 1 must also be an integer. And in fact, they are two consecutive integers. Well, when you have the product of, well, two consecutive integers, one of which I know is even and one is odd. When I multiply an even and an odd number together, I get an even number. So I know that y times y plus 1 is even. Therefore, x times y is also even, meaning that this statement is sufficient. I am always going to get yes as an answer to this question. So check DA. My two remaining answer choices are D and A. Now I go on to analyze statement 2 by itself. X over y is an even integer. So I could write this as x over y is, well, let's say 2 times some integer. 2n is an even integer. Now what could I solve for? I could solve for xy again. Multiply both sides by y squared and get xy equals 2ny squared. Now, I could realize that 2ny squared is an even integer, but if I don't, I could go on to my plan B, which is to solve for xy over 2, right? If I divide both sides by 2, I get xy over 2 equals ny squared. And I know that n is an integer and y is an integer, so ny squared must also be an integer. So I know that xy over 2 is an integer. And I'll always get yes to the question. And so this statement is also going to be sufficient. Check and D. Okay, so let's take a look at the next question, right? So we've got decimals and percents. Obviously, if anything was unclear, if you had any questions with the previous exercise, we would talk about that, and I could continue to explain it if you have any specific questions, right? If not, we'll move on to the next question. So this is a problem-solving question, and the first thing that I'm going to do with any problem-solving question is I'm going to look first at the answers, right? I want to spend a couple of seconds making some basic observations about the answer choices. And what I notice first is that the answers are in percents. Okay, great. My brain starts thinking about percents and things that I know about percents. What else do I notice? I notice that the answers are in increasing order. Okay, well, this tells me that if I need to plug in the answers and back solve, I may want to start with the middle answer first, because if it's too big or too small, I can eliminate 3 of the wrong answers, right? I also noticed that some of the numbers are bigger than 100% and some are less than 100%. This might be useful if I want to estimate and eliminate some obviously wrong answers. And last but not least, after a couple of observations that were good news, an observation which is a little bit of a bad news, which is that some of the answers are like B and C are not very friendly numbers, right? They're not integers. They're not, they're kind of weird decimals. And so because of that, I know that maybe the math might get confusing, right? If, however, the answers were 40%, 50%, 60%, etc., then I would know that the math should be pretty easy and pretty simple, and that if the math starts getting very complicated, I would know earlier in the process that I should probably stop and see if I made a mistake, because the math shouldn't be getting too complicated. So this is one way for me to save time when I'm making a mistake. I don't have to wait until I get all the way to the wrong destination before I realize that I'm going the wrong way, right? So I'm going to spend a couple of seconds making these observations, not a long time. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to continue to work backwards by identifying the question. My question is, what is the percent increase from March to April in the number of female customers of the company? Okay, I see the keywords percent increase, and I know a formula for that. I know that if I take the new number minus the old number or original number and put that over the original number, I will get my percent increase. So in this case, my new number is April. I'm subtracting my original number March and putting it over March. So this is what I'm looking for. Great. Now what I can do is I can go back to the beginning and break down the background information in chunks, and each chunk becomes a piece of information that I write down. So let's take a look. In March, 25% of a certain company's 80 customers were females. Okay, we're going to stop right there. This looks like a good place to stop. So they've just defined March for me. Now, I could write down everything, right? 25% or 25 over 100 times 80. But calculating 25%, I've got a shortcut for that. It's 1/4. So I can simply divide 80 by 4 and get my answer, right? March equals 20. Now let's look at the next chunk of information. And in April, 40% of its 160 customers were males. So A is 40% of 160. Well, wait a minute. Hold on. I almost fell for a trap, right? Notice that we're talking about female customers, and now they slipped in some information about male customers. The GMAT loves to do this. They love to give us information indirectly so that we have to do an extra step in order to solve the problem. So in fact, instead of 40% of 160, we want to calculate 60%, which is going to be represent the number of females. So 60% of 160, one way to do this in your head would be to take half and add 10%. Because half and 10% are two things that are both very easy to calculate. Half of 160 is 80, 10% is 16. I add them up and I get 96, right? So now that I have M and A, I can go back and plug them into my question, which is 96 minus 20 over 20. Now, before I do any more math here, I want to go back and ask myself, right, is my answer going to be greater than or less than 100%? Well, I know that 96 minus 20 is greater than 20, so it's going to be greater than 100%. So I can eliminate 3 of my wrong answers without really doing any math, right? And now that I look at my last 2 answers, I can see that there's a huge gap between them. And so in fact, I simply need to know, is my answer greater than or less than 300%? 300%, if I wanted to represent it in a fraction with 20 in the denominator, would be 60 over 20. So now my question is 96 minus 20 greater than or less than 60? And it equals 76. So it's going to be greater than 60. So D is out and E is our correct answer. Okay, so sometimes you don't actually have to do all of the math in order to get a right answer, right? As long as you can eliminate 4 wrong answers, it doesn't matter how you got to the right answer. So a lot of times what I'll do is, as I'm working through a process, as you can see, I'll check in with my answers, I'll see if I can eliminate some wrong answers, or I'll see if there's a way that I can estimate so that I don't actually have to do all of the math, right? In this case, the math was relatively easy, but in other cases, they've written the question so that the math is so complex that you have to find these shortcuts. You have to look for the ways that you can estimate or determine a units digit of a number so that you can actually get there, whereas otherwise you couldn't even get to the right answer. So great, yeah. If you had any questions with this question, we would talk about that. But yeah, basically, this is more or less what my classes feel like, and kind of the type of tips that I give to my students. And I really hope you enjoyed this virtual trial class. And remember, studying for the GMAT is a marathon. And like every marathon, it starts with that first step.